The faint hum of conversations filled the cozy cafe on a crisp New York morning. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, casting golden patterns on the wooden tables. Robert Downey Jr., dressed in a simple navy sweater and jeans, sat quietly in a corner booth, sipping his coffee. For once, he wasn't Iron Man or Sherlock Holmes, just a man enjoying a rare moment of peace away from the relentless spotlight. His phone was off, and for the first time in weeks he felt truly present. As he stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, his eyes wandered around the room. Families chatted over pancakes, baristas called out orders, and children laughed near the counter. It was an ordinary scene, but something, or rather, someone, caught his attention. A little girl with messy brown curls sat at a nearby table, clutching a tattered stuffed bear to her chest. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old, yet there was a weight in her gaze that seemed far too heavy for a child. Her wide eyes kept darting toward him, as if she were trying to summon the courage to approach. At the same table, a man sat stiffly, scrolling through his phone. He wore an expensive suit, his polished shoes tapping impatiently against the floor. Every few seconds, he glanced sharply at the girl, his expression cold and unyielding. The contrast between them was striking, the girl's vulnerability versus the man's calculated demeanor. Robert frowned slightly, sensing an unease that didn't belong in such a cheerful setting. He leaned back in his seat, taking another sip of his coffee, and tried to shake off the feeling. Maybe he was overthinking it. After all, what did he know about their lives? Perhaps the man was just having a bad day and the girl was simply shy. But then the girl slid off her chair. Clutching her bear tightly, she took hesitant steps toward Robert. The world seemed to slow as she approached, her small frame trembling with every step. When she stopped beside his table, her voice was barely audible, almost swallowed by the ambient noise of the cafe. Can I tell you something?" she whispered, her words trembling like leaves in the wind. Robert leaned closer, his brow furrowing. "Of course," he said gently, his tone warm and inviting. But before the girl could speak, the man at the table stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His sharp gaze locked onto Robert, sending a chill down the actor's spine. Something about this encounter felt wrong, very wrong. And as the man began walking toward them, Robert realized this quiet morning was about to take a turn he never expected. The man stopped a few feet away, his presence commanding yet unsettling. He adjusted his tie with deliberate movements, his eyes narrowing as he studied Robert. "Is everything okay here?" he asked, his voice smooth but laced with an edge of irritation. Robert nodded, keeping his expression calm. "Everything's fine. Your daughter just wanted to say hello." The man glanced at the girl, who had taken a small step back, retreating slightly behind Robert's chair. "She's not very good with strangers," the man said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Come on, sweetheart. We need to go." But the girl didn't move. Instead, she clutched her bear even tighter, her knuckles turning white. Robert noticed the way her tiny body trembled, the fear in her eyes unmistakable. He crouched down to her level, his voice soft and reassuring. "It's okay. You can tell me what's wrong." The girl hesitated, glancing nervously at the man before whispering, "I can't talk here. He'll get mad." Robert's heart sank. He looked up at the man, who was now tapping his foot impatiently, his jaw clenched. There was something off about him, something Robert couldn't quite put his finger on, but his instincts screamed that this wasn't a situation to ignore. "I think we should stay a little longer," Robert said, his tone polite but firm. "She seems like she needs a moment." The man's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. "We don't have time for this. We're late for an appointment." He reached out to grab the girl's arm, but Robert stood quickly, positioning himself between them. "Appointments can wait," Robert said, his voice steady. "If she has something to say, maybe we should listen." The tension in the cafe grew palpable. Other patrons glanced over curiously, sensing the unease. The man's expression hardened, his patience wearing thin. "This isn't your business," he said, his voice low and threatening. "Stay out of it." Robert didn't budge. He kept his focus on the girl, whose eyes were brimming with tears. "It's okay," he whispered to her. "You're safe here." The man let out an irritated sigh, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "Fine. Take your moment. But make it quick." He stepped back, crossing his arms as he watched them closely, his gaze piercing. Robert turned his attention back to the girl, crouching down again. "What's your name?" he asked softly. "Lila," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hi Lila. I'm Robert. Can you tell me what's going on?" Lila glanced nervously at the man before leaning in closer. Her voice was so low that Robert had to strain to hear her. "He's not my dad," she whispered. "He took me from my mom. She's hurt. She can't get up." Robert's stomach tightened. He forced himself to remain calm, knowing that any reaction could escalate the situation. "Where is your mom, Lila?" he asked gently. "She's at home." He said no one would believe me if I told. Her tiny hands clutched the bear tighter, her knuckles white with fear. Robert's mind raced. He needed to act carefully, but he also knew he couldn't let this moment pass. As he stood, he discreetly reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Under the guise of checking the time, he sent a quick text to a trusted contact. "Need help. Possible emergency at Café Bliss on 5th Avenue." The man noticed the movement and stepped forward, his expression darkening. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "Just checking the time," Robert replied smoothly, slipping the phone back into his pocket. "So, Lila, tell me more about your bear. Does he have a name?" The man's eyes narrowed, suspicion evident in his stance. "Enough of this," he said sharply. "We're leaving. Now." But Lila didn't move. She stayed close to Robert, her small body trembling. The man reached out again, but Robert placed a hand on his shoulder, stopping him. "I think she needs a little more time," he said firmly. "Kids deserve to be heard." The man's patience snapped. "Don't interfere where you're not wanted," he growled, his voice low and menacing. Before things could escalate further, the cafe door opened, and 2 police officers stepped inside. They scanned the room, their eyes landing on the tense scene unfolding at Robert's table. One of them approached cautiously. "Is everything okay here?" Robert exhaled slowly, relief washing over him. "We might have a situation," he said quietly, gesturing toward Lila. "She needs help." The man's face turned pale, his composure cracking for the first time. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, stepping back. But the officers were already moving closer, their expressions serious. And just like that, the quiet morning Robert had hoped for transformed into something far greater. A chance to make a difference in a life that desperately needed saving. The cafe grew quieter, as if the world around them had slowed to a standstill. Robert Downey Jr. crouched down to Lila's level, his expression soft and reassuring. "It's okay, sweetheart," he said gently. "You can tell me what's going on." Lila hesitated, her free hand clutching the hem of her faded pink dress. Her eyes darted around the room, checking to see if anyone else was listening. Finally, in a voice so low it was almost a whisper, she replied, "I can't talk here. He'll get mad." Robert took a deep breath, his heart sinking. He could tell Lila was scared, but whatever was happening had to be serious for her to seek help from a complete stranger. "It's okay, Lila," he said, his tone steady and calm. "You're safe now." Before Robert could say more, the man, whose name he now knew was Mr. Grayson, rose from his seat. He adjusted his suit jacket with deliberate movements and began walking toward them. His steps were measured, each one exuding authority and control. Robert stood slowly, positioning himself between Lila and Mr. Grayson as the man approached. Mr. Grayson stopped a few steps away, forcing a smile that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Sorry about this," he said smoothly, his voice laced with irritation. "Lila can be a bit overly curious at times. I hope she hasn't been bothering you." Robert remained calm, his gaze fixed on Mr. Grayson. Years of experience reading people had taught him to trust his instincts, and something about this man set off alarm bells. Without breaking eye contact, Robert replied with a relaxed smile. "Actually, she was just showing me her bear. It looks broken. She must really love it." Mr. Grayson narrowed his eyes for a moment before forcing another polite response. "Ah, yes, she's quite attached to it." He then extended his hand toward Lila. "Come on, sweetheart. It's time for us to go." But Lila took a step back, slightly hiding behind Robert. She didn't say a word, but the gesture was enough to chip away at Mr. Grayson's patience. His smile faltered briefly and he let out an irritated sigh. "Look, I appreciate you keeping her entertained, but we have somewhere to be." "Excuse us," he said, moving to grab Lila. Before he could reach the girl, Robert gently placed a hand on Mr. Grayson's shoulder, stopping him. "Commitments can wait," Robert said firmly. "I think Lila needs a moment. She seemed eager to talk to me about her bear. Maybe we can figure that out first?" The waitress, who had been observing the growing tension, approached with a tray in her hands. "Is everything okay here?" she asked, casting a suspicious glance at Mr. Grayson. Robert smiled at her. "It's fine. Actually, could you bring Lila a drink? She looks like she could use something." The waitress nodded but gave Mr. Grayson another wary look before walking away. As soon as she left, Robert discreetly took out his phone and began typing a message to an emergency contact. He knew he had to act quickly. Mr. Grayson noticed the movement and stepped closer. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but this has gone far enough," he said, his tone growing firmer. He tried to maintain control, but his eyes betrayed growing impatience. Robert smiled again, though his expression had become more serious. "I'm just trying to help a girl who seems like she needs someone to listen. I'm sure you can understand that." Lila, still clutching her bear, finally spoke, her voice trembling. "I don't want to go. Please, can I stay here?" The boy's simple plea made Mr. Grayson freeze for a moment. He looked at Robert, his expression hardening before saying, "I suggest you don't meddle where you're not wanted." Robert kept his composure, but he knew he was dealing with something far more complex than he had initially thought. Lila was clearly scared, and any wrong move could put her in danger. He needed to tread carefully, but he also knew he couldn't leave her alone. Robert pressed send on his phone, the message for help already on its way. Mr. Grayson stared directly at him, the two locked in a silent confrontation. Robert knew time was running out. The air in the cafe felt heavier, despite the usual background noise of voices and laughter. Robert, standing between Lila and Mr. Grayson, could feel the weight of the situation. The girl, small and vulnerable, clutched the tattered bear to her chest, as if it were her shield against the world. Her anxious eyes were locked on Robert. He crouched down again, trying to reassure her. His voice was soft, almost a whisper. "You can tell me what's going on. I'm here to listen." Lila glanced around nervously, checking if Mr. Grayson was still watching. The man, now seated back at the table, kept a fixed, threatening gaze on them, phone in hand, as if he were waiting for something. Lila gripped the bear tighter and finally stepped closer. She leaned slightly toward Robert and murmured, "He did something bad to my mom. Can you help?" Robert froze for a moment. The girl's low, trembling voice carried something he recognized immediately, a cry for help. He knew this wasn't the time for unnecessary questions. The priority now was ensuring Lila's safety. Robert looked directly into the girl's eyes. "It's okay. I'll help. I promise," he replied, his voice firm but reassuring. Lila nodded timidly, but the fear in her eyes didn't fade. She glanced back at Mr. Grayson once more, as if dreading that he might already know what she had just said. Mr. Grayson noticed the exchange between Robert and Lila and stood up abruptly. He adjusted his suit jacket, walking toward them with slow, deliberate steps. His forced smile failed to hide the growing irritation in his demeanor. "Sorry to interrupt, but Lila and I were just leaving. Thanks for keeping her entertained," he said, extending a hand to take Lila. Before he could touch the girl, Robert stood and blocked his path. Although his posture remained relaxed, something in Robert's expression made Mr. Grayson hesitate. "She's still telling me about her bear. I think she wants a few more minutes," Robert said, his voice calm yet firm. Mr. Grayson narrowed his eyes, clearly irritated by the interference. "That's very kind of you, but she's with me. We have an appointment, so..." Robert didn't budge. He maintained his position, looking directly at Mr. Grayson. "Kids need time to talk. I'm sure you understand that, right?" For a moment, Mr. Grayson seemed to lose his patience, but he quickly regained his controlled expression. "Of course, but we don't have time to waste." He turned his attention to Lila, who was now hiding behind Robert. "Let's go, Lila. It's time to leave." Before Mr. Grayson could insist, the waitress appeared again, holding her notepad. She discreetly placed a folded piece of paper on the table where Robert was seated. Pretending it was a napkin, Robert picked it up and read it quickly. "The police are on their way." Robert felt a wave of relief, but he knew the danger was far from over. He looked at Lila and offered a small, reassuring smile. Then he turned back to Mr. Grayson. "Why don't we all sit down for a moment? It seems like Lila just needs a little time to breathe. Sometimes kids just want to be heard." Mr. Grayson gave a cold stare but reluctantly nodded. He returned to the table, though his eyes never left Robert and Lila. Muttering into his phone, he appeared more agitated with every passing moment. Robert knew time was running out. He needed to protect Lila while also figuring out more about what was happening. Mr. Grayson ended his phone call and stood again, adjusting his suit jacket. He shot a hard look at Robert and Lila, his expression now darker and more threatening. "You have no idea what you're getting yourselves into," Mr. Grayson muttered, starting to walk toward the door. Robert knew the next decision would be crucial. The moment of truth was closing in fast. The air in the cafe grew heavier with each passing second. Robert Downey Jr. stood protectively beside Lila, his calm demeanor masking the storm of thoughts racing through his mind. Mr. Grayson's patience was visibly fraying, his polished exterior beginning to crack under the weight of the situation. The two officers, now fully aware of the tension, moved closer to the table, their presence commanding yet cautious. Officer Ramirez, a tall man with sharp eyes, addressed the group first. "We received a call about a potential issue here. Is everything okay?" His tone was firm but measured, leaving no room for evasion. Mr. Grayson straightened his tie, forcing a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Everything's fine, officer. There must have been some misunderstanding. I'm just here with my daughter, enjoying a quiet morning." Before the officers could respond, Robert stepped forward, keeping Lila close to his side. "Officers," he said calmly, "I think you should hear what the girl has to say." All eyes turned to Lila, who clutched her tattered bear tightly, her knuckles white with fear. Officer Vega, a woman with a kind face and reassuring voice, crouched down to Lila's level. "Hi there," she said gently, "my name's Vega. Can you tell me your name?" Lila hesitated, glancing up at Robert for reassurance. He nodded encouragingly, giving her shoulder a light squeeze. Finally she whispered, "Lila?" "Lila," Vega repeated softly, her smile warm and inviting. "It's okay. Can you tell us what's going on? We're here to help." Lila's wide eyes darted nervously between Vega and Mr. Grayson, whose forced calm was beginning to slip. "Don't say anything, Lila," he snapped, his voice sharp and cutting through the tense atmosphere. "We're leaving." Ramirez stepped forward, blocking Mr. Grayson's path. "I suggest you stay where you are, sir. We're not going anywhere until we understand what's happening here." The authority in Ramirez's voice seemed to give Lila a small boost of courage. She took a deep breath, her tiny voice trembling but clear. He hurt my mom. And he said no one would believe me." The cafe fell silent, the hum of conversations replaced by an eerie stillness. Vega and Ramirez exchanged a glance, their expressions serious. Robert crouched beside Lila again, his voice steady and reassuring. "You did the right thing by telling us, sweetheart. It's okay now." Mr. Grayson's composure shattered. "This is ridiculous," he exclaimed, his voice rising. "She's just a child. She's making things up." He turned toward the officers, his tone laced with indignation. "My lawyer is going to love this." Ramirez remained calm, his hand resting lightly on Mr. Grayson's chest to stop him from moving. "Sir, it seems we have sufficient cause to investigate this situation. We'll need you to come with us." Mr. Grayson's face darkened with anger. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," he growled, attempting to push past the officers. But Vega acted swiftly, grabbing his arm with a firm grip. "Are you resisting a police order?" she asked sharply as she secured handcuffs around his wrists. Robert watched silently, standing protectively beside Lila, who now appeared slightly relieved but still visibly shaken. As the officers escorted Mr. Grayson out of the cafe, he muttered bitterly, "You'll regret this. You don't know what you've gotten yourselves into." Once Mr. Grayson was gone, Robert turned his attention back to Lila. "Do you want to show me where your mom is? We can go there now with the police." Lila nodded slowly, clutching her bear in one hand and Robert's hand in the other. Her voice was barely audible as she whispered, "I just want her to be okay." The cafe had calmed down, but the tension lingered in the air. Customers watched in silence, some whispering among themselves as Mr. Grayson was led away. Inside, Robert stayed close to Lila, ensuring the girl felt safe. She still clutched her bear, her small hands trembling with the force of her grip. Robert crouched down beside her again. "Lila, we're going to take care of this. The police are here and they're going to help us. Do you want to tell me more about what happened with your mom?" Lila looked up at Robert, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. She hesitated for a moment before speaking in a low voice. He yelled at her. Then she fell on the floor. She said she'd be okay, but I know she wasn't. Robert felt a lump in his throat. The girl's words were simple, but the weight they carried was heartbreaking. He knew they needed to act fast. Standing, he signaled to the officers, who returned inside after securing Mr. Grayson in a patrol car. "She's afraid to go home," Robert told Officer Ramirez. "And she's worried about her mom. We need to get there as soon as possible." Ramirez nodded, pulling out a small notepad to write down the address. Officer Vega knelt beside Lila, speaking to her directly with a gentle tone. "Lila, can you take us to your house? We're going to make sure your mom is okay." Lila hesitated again, glancing at Robert for reassurance. When he nodded, she gave a small, timid nod. "I can show you, but he always locks the door. I don't know how to get in." Robert placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Don't worry, we'll figure it out." As the officers prepared to leave, a restaurant employee approached them with a small backpack. This was left behind by the man who was sitting with the girl, the employee explained. Vega opened the bag cautiously, revealing a notebook filled with detailed notes. The pages contained observations about Lila and her mother's daily routines, plans for their movements, and even sketches of their home. It was chilling evidence of control and manipulation. Outside, Mr. Grayson shouted from inside the patrol car, "You're making a mistake. You don't have any proof. I'm an innocent man." Ramirez ignored the outburst as Vega helped Robert and Lila into the police car. During the ride, Robert tried to keep Lila calm, sharing small stories to distract her. "Did you know bears are really easy to fix? I'm sure once all of this is over we can figure out how to fix yours." For the first time, Lila gave a faint smile, though her eyes still seemed distant. "Do you think my mom is going to be okay?" she asked quietly. Robert looked at her and answered sincerely, "We're going to do everything we can to make sure she is." As the car approached Lila's house, the atmosphere grew heavy with tension. The street was eerily quiet and the windows of the house were dark. Vega noticed the front door was slightly ajar, prompting Ramirez to hit the brakes immediately. "Stay here," he ordered Robert and Lila as he and Vega stepped out of the car, drawing their weapons. Robert turned to Lila and said softly, "Stay with me. We're not going to let anything happen." Outside, the officers approached the house cautiously, the silence around them feeling more threatening than any noise. When Ramirez pushed the door open, what they found inside would change everything. The front door creaked open as Officer Ramirez pushed it gently, his weapon drawn and his movements cautious. Vega followed closely behind, her flashlight cutting through the dim interior of the house. The air inside was heavy with unease, the silence broken only by the faint hum of a distant clock ticking somewhere in the shadows. What they found stopped them in their tracks. The living room was in disarray. Overturned furniture, shattered picture frames, and scattered belongings painted a grim picture of chaos and violence. In the center of it all lay Sarah, Ethan's mother, unconscious on the floor. Her blonde hair fanned out around her face, partially obscuring the small cut on her forehead that had dried into a dark streak. Her breathing was shallow but steady, a sign that she was still alive. "Call for paramedics," Ramirez instructed sharply, holstering his weapon as he knelt beside Sarah to assess her condition. Vega quickly relayed the message over her radio while keeping an eye on the surroundings. Robert stood just outside the doorway, holding Lila close as she buried her face against his chest, unable to look at the scene unfolding before them. Within minutes, the wail of sirens filled the quiet street as paramedics arrived, rushing into the house with medical kits in hand. They worked efficiently, stabilizing Sarah and carefully lifting her onto a stretcher. As they wheeled her out, Lila broke free from Robert's grasp and ran to her mother, tears streaming down her face. "Mommy," she cried, clutching Sarah's limp hand. Robert crouched beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "She's going to be okay, sweetheart. The doctors are taking good care of her." Lila nodded weakly, though her tiny body trembled with emotion. Robert stayed close, ensuring she didn't feel alone in this overwhelming moment. Meanwhile, Vega returned to the group, holding Harris's abandoned backpack. She opened it cautiously, revealing a notebook filled with meticulous notes and sketches. "These are detailed observations about Sarah and Lila's daily routines," Vega explained, her voice tinged with disbelief. "He was planning to take Lila out of state tomorrow morning. There are even maps and schedules here." Ramirez shook his head grimly. "This isn't just abuse, it's premeditated kidnapping. We'll make sure he faces every charge possible." Outside, Harris sat handcuffed in the back of a patrol car, his expression dark and brooding. He glared at Robert and Lila as they passed by, muttering threats under his breath. But Robert didn't flinch. His focus remained entirely on Lila, who clung to him tightly, her trust unwavering despite everything she'd been through. As the ambulance sped away with Sarah, Robert turned to Vega. "Can I ride with them? She needs to know her daughter is safe." Vega hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Of course. We'll follow up later to get your statement." At the hospital, the hours dragged on as doctors worked tirelessly to ensure Sarah's recovery. Finally, a physician emerged from the examination room, offering a reassuring smile. "She's stable," he announced. "Her injuries aren't life-threatening and with rest she'll recover fully." Relief washed over Lila's face as she hugged Robert tightly. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible but filled with gratitude. Sarah regained consciousness later that evening, her eyes fluttering open to find Lila sitting beside her bed, clutching her hand. Tears welled up in her eyes as she pulled her daughter into a gentle embrace. "I'm so sorry, baby," she murmured, her voice hoarse but filled with love. "I should have protected you better." "You did protect me, Mommy," Lila replied softly. "You told me to tell someone if I was scared. So I did." Robert stood nearby, watching the tender reunion with a lump in his throat. When Sarah noticed him, she gestured for him to come closer. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "You saved us." Robert smiled warmly, brushing off the praise with characteristic humility. "I was just in the right place at the right time. The real hero here is Lila. She had the courage to ask for help when she needed it most." Inspired by the resilience of this family, Robert decided to do more. He reached out to local organizations supporting victims of domestic violence, offering not only financial assistance but also using his platform to raise awareness. He arranged for Lila's tattered bear to be repaired, presenting it to her during one of their visits. "Even broken things can be fixed," he told her with a wink. "Just like people." Months later, the community came together to honor Lila's bravery at a special ceremony hosted by the police department. Clutching her repaired bear, Lila shyly accepted an award recognizing her as a young hero. Afterward, she approached Robert with a drawing she had made, a simple sketch of a man and a little girl holding hands, with the words "My hero" scrawled across the top in colorful letters. Robert knelt down to her level, smiling as he accepted the gift. "You're the real hero, Lila," he said sincerely. "Asking for help takes more courage than anything else. Never forget that." As the crowd applauded, Robert stepped back, watching Lila reunite with her mother. The two shared a laugh, their bond stronger than ever. For Robert, it was a reminder of why he had chosen to step in that day, not because he was famous or extraordinary, but because sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to listen to change the course of someone else's life. The ceremony honoring Lila as a young hero was held in a small community center, its walls adorned with colorful banners and heartfelt messages from those who had been touched by her bravery. Families filled the room, their faces glowing with pride and admiration for the little girl who had found the courage to speak up when it mattered most. As Lila stepped onto the stage to receive her award, a simple plaque engraved with the words "Courage changes lives," the audience erupted into applause. Robert sat in the front row, watching with a mix of pride and humility. When Lila turned to look at him after receiving her award, he gave her an encouraging nod and a warm smile. She walked over to him shyly, clutching the drawing she had made earlier, a picture of a man and a little girl holding hands, with the words "My hero" written across the top in bold, uneven letters. "For you," she said softly, handing it to him. Her voice was still quiet, but there was a newfound confidence in her eyes. Robert knelt down to her level, accepting the gift with genuine gratitude. "Thank you, Lila," he said sincerely. "But remember this, you're the real hero here. Asking for help takes more courage than anything else. Never forget that." Lila nodded, her lips curling into a small but radiant smile. It was a moment of pure connection, one that reminded Robert why he had chosen to step in that day, not because he was famous or extraordinary but because sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to listen to change the course of someone else's life. After the ceremony, Robert spent some time talking with Sarah, Lila's mother. She was still recovering emotionally, but her strength was evident in the way she spoke about rebuilding their lives. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You didn't just save us, you gave us hope." Robert shook his head, brushing off the praise with characteristic humility. "Hope comes from within, Sarah. You and Lila are proof of that. All I did was show up." Inspired by their resilience, Robert decided to do more. He reached out to local organizations supporting victims of domestic violence, offering not only financial assistance but also using his platform to raise awareness. He arranged for Lila's tattered bear to be repaired, presenting it to her during one of their visits. "Even broken things can be fixed," he told her with a wink. "Just like people." Months later, as Robert reflected on the experience, he realized how much it had impacted him. In a world often overshadowed by chaos and uncertainty, stories like Lila's served as powerful reminders of the strength of the human spirit. They reminded him that even the smallest acts of kindness could ripple outward, creating waves of change far beyond what anyone might expect. And so, as he stood on stage at another charity event months later, addressing a crowd eager to hear his story, Robert shared these final thoughts. "We all have moments in our lives when we feel powerless, when the weight of the world seems too heavy to bear. But in those moments, we must remember that courage isn't about being fearless, it's about taking action despite our fears. Whether it's reaching out for help or extending a hand to someone in need, every act of bravery matters. Because together, we can create a world where no one has to face their struggles alone. As the audience rose to their feet in applause, Robert felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He knew the journey wasn't over, there would always be more people to help, more stories to tell, and more lives to touch. But for now, he took solace in knowing that he had made a difference, however small, in the lives of two remarkable individuals. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect on the power of courage and compassion. We all have the ability to make a difference in someone's life, whether it's through a simple act of kindness or standing up for what's right. Share this video with your friends and family to inspire others to find their own moments of bravery. And if you'd like to support causes like the ones mentioned in this story, consider donating to organizations dedicated to helping victims of domestic violence. Together we can build a brighter future for everyone. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories of hope, resilience, and triumph. Every story matters, and yours could be the one that changes someone's life. Thank you for watching, and remember, courage starts with a single step. Take yours today.